the famous doctor disguised as a janitor to catch the nurses mocking the poor. So here is what this is about. There is a man, he is one of the most famous heart surgeons in the world. People wait years just to get an appointment with him. His name alone makes other doctors stop and pay attention. And one day he walks into his own hospital. Not in his white coat, not with his name badge, not with the respect that every single person in that building gives him every single day. He walks in wearing a dirty janitor uniform, carrying a mop. He has a beard he grew specifically, so nobody would recognize him. He has a button camera on his shirt so small you cannot see it. And he spends his days cleaning floors and watching how the nurses treat the rich patients, and watching how they treat the poor ones. What he sees makes him so angry he can barely hold it inside. But then something happens that nobody planned. A very old woman arrives at the hospital. She is holding her chest. She can barely walk, she needs help immediately. And the nurses laugh at her. They laugh at her shoes, they laugh at her clothes, they tell her to go somewhere else. And the janitor watches all of this. Then the old woman collapses. And the janitor does something that stops every single person in that hallway. But that is not even the biggest surprise of this story. Because that old woman, she has a secret too. A secret that goes back 30 years. A secret that connects her to the janitor in a way that nobody in that hospital could possibly have predicted. Stay right here. This story has 2 twists and both of them will hit you hard. If you believe that how you treat people who cannot help you says everything about who you really are, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Folktale Peak and hit the notification bell. And drop a comment telling us where you are watching from today. Now let us begin. His full name was Dr. Julian Emmanuel Osei. But nobody called him Julian Emmanuel anymore. Not since he was in his 20s. By the time this story begins, he was simply Dr. Osei to his patients, Dr. Julian to his colleagues, and the doctor to the people who worked in the building he had built into one of the most respected cardiac care facilities on the continent. He was 54 years old. He was 6 feet tall and carried himself in the specific way of someone who has spent 30 years walking into rooms where the most serious things happen and staying calm in all of them. His hair was fully grey now, which he had been self-conscious about at 40 and had completely stopped thinking about by 45. His hands were the most famous thing about him. They were steady and precise and had operated on over 3,000 hearts in 30 years of surgical practice, a number that still surprised him when he said it out loud, which he rarely did. He did not come from money. This was the first thing about him that people who only saw him in the hospital, in his white coat with his title on his badge and his team around him, would not have guessed. He looked like a man who had always inhabited this kind of world. He looked like a man who had grown up with certainty and comfort and the natural expectation of professional success. He had not. Julian was born in 1970 in Kumasi, Ghana, the second of 4 children of a man named Emmanuel Osei, who repaired bicycles and small engines from a covered yard behind the family's rented house, and a woman named Grace, who sold fabric from a stall at the central market. Neither parent had completed secondary school. Both worked from early morning until evening every day of their lives, and the money that came in was enough to keep the house running and the children in school with nothing significant left over. The house was 3 rooms. The 4 children shared a bedroom. There was a kitchen with a kerosene stove and a small yard where Grace kept 3 chickens. The electricity was unreliable. When it went out in the evenings, which was often, the children did their homework by kerosene lamp, and Julian did his homework with the focused intensity of someone who understood very early that the lamp would not burn forever and the time was limited. He was an observant child. His mother Grace said, when Julian was 7 years old, that the boy watched things the way a cat watches a mouse. She did not mean it critically. She meant that Julian paid attention in a way that was not common in a child his age. He paid attention to how things worked, why the bicycle in his father's yard had stopped running, why the woman at the market stall beside his mother's sold more at certain times of day and less at others. Why some of the children at school understood the mathematics teacher's explanations immediately, and others did not. He was trying to understand the mechanics of things. All things, this was simply how his mind worked. At school, he was not the most naturally gifted child in his class. There were children who absorbed the curriculum with a speed that made it look effortless. Julian was not in that category. He was in a different category, the child for whom learning required genuine effort and who applied that effort without limit. He stayed after school when he could. He reread chapters that confused him until they did not confuse him. He asked questions without embarrassment about asking, which took a specific kind of courage in a classroom where asking too many questions could attract social cost. The mathematics teacher, a serious man named Mr. Akampong, who had been teaching for 22 years and who had learned to distinguish genuine curiosity from performance, noticed Julian in his second year. He said to Julian after class one afternoon, "You are slow to start, but you never stop. Do you understand what that means?" Julian said, "I think so, sir." Mr. Akampong said, "It means you will go further than most of the fast starters. Hold that, do not be embarrassed by the slowness. The people who never stop are the people who arrive." Julian held that. He wrote it in his notebook and he held it for 30 years, and he still thought about it sometimes in the specific way of a person who received something important and has kept it. He was 12 when he decided he wanted to be a doctor. The decision did not come from a dramatic event, it came from watching. His younger sister Abina was seriously ill when he was 12. A fever that would not break, that went on for 4 days while Grace sat beside her bed and Emmanuel rode his bicycle to the clinic and back, and the family held itself in the tight grip of people who are waiting to find out which way something will go. The doctor who came was a young man in his 30s. He was not from a wealthy family either, Julian would learn later. He had come from a background not unlike Julian's own. But he arrived and his presence changed the room, not because of the medicine, though the medicine mattered, but because of the specific quality of his attention. He was completely present. He looked at Abina with the full focus of someone for whom this child was the most important thing in the world for the duration of this examination. He spoke to Grace in a way that reduced her panic by giving her information she could act on. He spoke to Emmanuel in a way that gave him something to do, which was what Emmanuel needed. Abina recovered. On the 3rd day after the doctor's visit, when the fever broke and Abina's eyes came back into proper focus, and she asked for food, Julian sat in the yard outside the house and thought about what the doctor had done. He had not done magic. Julian was 12 and understood that medicine was not magic. What he had done was apply knowledge to a situation in a way that changed the outcome. He had walked into a room where people were frightened and unable to act, and he had provided both the technical solution and the human steadiness that made the technical solution possible. I want to do that, Julian thought. I want to be the person who walks into the room like that. Secondary school was where the education got serious. He went to Kumasi Technical Secondary School on a partial scholarship that his primary school teacher had helped him apply for, which covered half the fees and left the other half for his parents to manage through the specific arithmetic of 2 working people, cutting everything else to make space for one thing that mattered more. The school was a long bus ride from the family house. Julian left before 6 every morning. He came home after 6 every evening. In between was school and then an hour at the school library doing additional reading before the library closed, and then the bus and then homework by kerosene lamp if the electricity was out or under the single bulb in the shared bedroom if it was not. This was his life for 5 years. He was not unhappy. He was busy, which is different from unhappy, and he was moving towards something, which made the busyness feel purposeful rather than exhausting. He was also, during these years, developing the specific skills that would define him as a surgeon 30 years later: patience, precision, and the ability to hold a clear focus on one thing for an extended period without the focus degrading. He was also developing something else. He was developing an understanding of what it cost his parents to support his education. He saw it in the specific places where money did not appear that it had appeared before: the shoes that were not replaced when they should have been, the fabric stall that did not get the new shipment for an extra month, the bicycle repairs that Emmanuel took on late into the evening when he was clearly tired because the extra income from the evening jobs was going somewhere specific. Julian knew where it was going. He did not address this directly with his parents because he understood that addressing it would make them uncomfortable and would not change anything practical. But he held it. He added it to the account he was keeping in his mind of what this education was costing the people who loved him. He graduated secondary school with results that exceeded what anyone, except Mr. Akampong, had predicted. And this is where she enters the story. Her name was Mrs. Martha Asant. She was his primary school teacher. Not his secondary school teacher, his primary school teacher, which means she had taught him when he was 6 to 12 years old, in those first years that set the foundation. She was in her 40s when he was her student, a woman of medium height with reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck, and a manner that was simultaneously warm and completely no-nonsense, which was the combination that made her effective with children. She had taught at St. Michael's Primary School in Kumasi for 20 years by the time Julian was in her class. She had taught hundreds of children. She knew, with the specific diagnostic sense of an experienced teacher, which children had something that the others did not. Not intelligence necessarily, though intelligence mattered, but the particular combination of hunger and patience and ethical seriousness that produced people who built things. She had known Julian had it from his second week in her class. She watched him through 6 years of primary school. She watched him help other children with the work he had mastered himself. She watched him stay back to stack chairs or clean the board when the other children had gone, not to impress anyone, but because he saw that it needed doing. She watched him on the day the school charity collection was organised, and every child brought what they could, and Julian brought the most he had, which was very little, but it was the most he had. She went to speak to his parents at the end of his final year of primary school. She sat with Grace and Emmanuel in the small kitchen of their rented house, and she told them, "Your son is exceptional," not as a performance of praise, as a clinical assessment, and she told them what she thought he needed and what she was going to do about it. She had connections, not wealthy connections but useful ones. A colleague who had moved to Accra and who knew the admissions coordinator at a good secondary school. A former student who worked at an educational foundation that administered small scholarships. She knew how to navigate the system of limited resources with the specific expertise of someone who had been doing it for 20 years. She spent 3 months of her own time making the phone calls and writing the letters and following up again that resulted in Julian's partial scholarship. When Julian found out, he went to her house. He was 12 years old. He stood at her door, and when she opened it, he said, "You did this." She said, "I helped." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because you are going to be someone who helps other people. And helping people who are going to help other people is the most efficient use of helping there is." He thought about this. He said, "How do you know I will help people?" She said, "Because you already do. You do it now at 12 without anyone asking you to. You do it because you see that it needs doing. That does not change. That is who you are." He said, "What do I do now?" She said, "Go to school, work, come back and tell me what you learned." He went to school. He worked. He came back and told her what he had learned. He did this throughout secondary school, visiting her house on school holidays, sitting in her kitchen while she made tea and telling her about what he was studying and what was difficult and what he was trying to understand. She listened to all of it. She asked questions. She had no medical or scientific training, but she had a mind that understood processes and structures, and she could follow the logic of what he was describing even when the specific content was beyond her expertise. She also had a small collection of books. Not medical books specifically, but books about science and human biology, and the history of medicine that she had accumulated over 20 years of teaching, and that she lent him one at a time, with the instruction to bring them back in better condition than he found them. He always did. When the time came for university applications, it was Martha who sat with him and went through every option and helped him decide which to apply to and how to present his application. She also, which she did not tell him until much later, contributed money to his first-year university fees. Not a large amount. She was a primary school teacher on a primary school teacher's salary, and she did not have large amounts. But she contributed what she had, and she did it without telling him because she knew he would have refused it. He found out when he was 32. He was already a qualified surgeon by then, already building his reputation, and he found out because a letter arrived at his address that had originally been sent to his parents and forwarded. It was a receipt, a payment receipt from 28 years earlier from his university's finance office in Martha's name. He held the receipt for a long time. Then he drove to Kumasi. He found her house. She was in her 70s by then, retired, living alone since her husband had passed, smaller than he remembered, the way people who were large in your childhood always seem smaller when you return to them as an adult. She opened the door. She said, "Julian, look at you." He held up the receipt. She looked at it, then she looked at him. She said, "I wondered when you would find that." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Because you would have refused it." He said, "I would have." She said, "And that would have been the wrong decision, so I made it for you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I am going to spend the rest of my career making sure that what you gave me is given to other people who need it." She said, "I know." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you have always been doing it. Every patient you save, Julian, every poor patient who walks into your hospital and receives the same care as the rich ones. That is me. That is what I invested in." He looked at her. She said, "Now come inside. I made tea and you look thin." He went inside. That was 22 years before the day that this story is really about. In those 22 years, Julian built everything. He specialized in cardiac surgery after his general surgical training. He chose cardiology because it was the hardest. The heart was the organ that did not forgive errors. The heart was the organ that required absolute precision and absolute steadiness and absolute calm, and Julian had always moved toward the things that required the most. He was brilliant, not the effortless brilliance of his childhood classmates who had absorbed everything quickly and then coasted. The earned brilliance of someone who has worked for decades and whose expertise is the accumulated product of 3,000 surgeries and 30 years of reading and thinking, and being wrong sometimes and understanding why and adjusting. His outcomes were exceptional. The survival rates in his unit were better than any comparable facility. His complication rates were the lowest in the region. Medical journals published his findings. Other surgeons came to observe his techniques. Medical schools invited him to lecture. He also built the hospital. OSI Cardiac Institute had started as a 20-bed unit in an existing facility 15 years ago, and was now a purpose-built 3-story building with state-of-the-art surgical suites, a cardiac intensive care unit, a rehabilitation center, and an outpatient department. He had raised the funding through a combination of medical research grants, private donations from grateful patients, and several years of his own salary that he had reinvested. The hospital had a policy, written by Julian and implemented from the first day of operation, that no patient would be denied care on the basis of their ability to pay. A portion of every surgical bed was reserved for patients who could not afford the full cost. A bursary fund covered the difference. This policy was not popular with every member of his board. The arguments against it were always the same. The hospital had to be financially sustainable, and the bursary fund created a cost structure that put pressure on the overall budget, and the long-term model was not proven, and other hospitals did not operate this way. Julian's response was always the same. Other hospitals operated the way they operated, and his hospital operated the way he operated, and his hospital's outcomes were better, and better outcomes attracted the patients who could afford full fees, and the financial model had been working for 15 years. The arguments continued periodically. He won all of them. But the policy had a gap. Not in the financial model, in the implementation. Julian had designed the policy at the strategic level and had trusted the management of it to his administrative team and his nursing staff, who were supposed to implement it with the same values he had written into it. What he had not done was check whether those values were actually being lived at the operational level, at the reception desk, in the interactions between his staff and the patients who arrived without money. He had heard things, not specific complaints with names and dates, those were easy to investigate and respond to. Softer things, a comment from a patient who mentioned that the reception experience had felt unwelcoming, a note in a patient satisfaction survey about the attitude of nursing staff towards certain patients, the specific unease he felt when he tried to piece these things together. He had asked his hospital administrator, a careful man named Mr. Darko, to look into it. Mr. Darko had looked into it and reported back that the policies were being followed and the staff were professional. Julian had listened to this report and had thought, Mr. Darko is a good administrator who investigates through official channels, and people who know they are being investigated behave properly during the investigation. He needed a different kind of investigation. He needed to see it himself, unannounced, without anyone knowing who he was. He thought about how to do this for 2 weeks. And then he went to a second-hand clothing shop, bought a uniform, grew a beard and became a janitor. Stay with us, because what he saw in that hospital in the first 2 days made his blood run cold. The uniform was grey. A grey work shirt and grey trousers that were slightly too big, which Julian had chosen deliberately because a uniform that fits perfectly on someone who is supposed to be a janitor looks slightly wrong. He had a grey cap that he wore pulled slightly forward. He had work boots that were old and clean, the clean important because a working man keeps his tools clean, even if the tools are simple. He had grown a beard over 3 weeks, not a fashionable beard, the beard of a man who has stopped thinking about his appearance because other things occupy his attention. He let it come in fully grey, which it did because his hair had been fully grey since 48, and he did not trim it. The result was a face that was recognisable to people who knew him very well and completely unrecognisable to people who did not. His own team did not know him very well in the way of faces. They knew his title, his posture in a surgical suite, his voice giving precise instructions. In a corridor moving a mop, they did not look at him at all. He had arranged the practical side with one person only. His personal assistant of 12 years, a woman named Mrs. Adwoa, who had managed every aspect of his professional life for over a decade, and who received the information that he was going undercover in his own hospital with the specific expression of someone who has worked for an unusual person long enough that unusual things no longer surprise them. She said, "For how long?" He said, "As long as it takes." She said, "And your surgical schedule?" He said, "The elective surgeries can be moved. The urgent cases I will handle on standard recall. If there is a true emergency, I will be available immediately." She said, "You understand that people who clean floors in this hospital earn the floor cleaning wage?" He said, "I know." She said, "You would like me to pay you the floor cleaning wage for the duration?" He said, "I would like you to pay that wage to the hospital's bursary fund in my name, and to pay me nothing additional." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I will make the arrangements." She did. She told the facilities manager that a new janitor was joining the team for a trial period, that his name was Emmanuel Johnson, and that he was to be assigned to the main hospital corridors and reception area. She gave him the paperwork that a new facilities employee would have. She told him where the janitor's equipment was stored and where the team took their breaks. He started on a Monday. The first thing that happened on the first morning was that a nurse walked past him with a coffee cup, and the coffee splashed from the cup onto his shoes. The nurse did not stop, she did not look at him, she continued walking. Julian looked at his shoes, then he continued mopping. He spent the first day observing the flow of the hospital, where people went, how they were received, what the interactions looked like at the reception desk, in the corridors, at the entrance to the various departments. He was quiet and methodical, and he moved through the building with the specific invisibility of someone whose job is maintenance. People moved around him the way they moved around furniture. He learned on the first day that there were 4 nurses who worked the reception and intake area on the day shift. 2 of them were the ones who had been mentioned in the comments and surveys, though not by name in the formal complaints. He identified them by their behavior. Their names were Sarah and Linda. Sarah Mensa was 31 years old, 7 years qualified, with a nursing record that showed competence and no formal complaints. She was the senior of the 2 at the reception desk, and she had the bearing of someone who understood the social hierarchy of the hospital with great precision, who mattered, who did not, and how to modulate her behavior accordingly. She was warm, professional, and attentive with patients who arrived in expensive clothes or with the specific language and bearing of people who were accustomed to being treated as significant. She moved quickly to greet them. She used their names. She offered additional assistance. She made phone calls on their behalf. With patients who arrived in worn clothes, who were hesitant or confused, who did not know the specific language of medical administration, she was different. Not visibly rude in the way that would have produced immediate formal complaints. Subtly different, slower to respond, less precise with information, less forthcoming with options. The specific administrative delay that made things marginally harder without being obviously hostile. Julian watched this for 1 full day. Linda Assant was 28 years old, 4 years qualified, quieter than Sarah in public but quicker in private. She followed Sarah's lead in every interaction he observed, adjusting her manner upward or downward to match Sarah's calibration. When Sarah was warm, Linda was warm. When Sarah was cool, Linda reflected the coolness. She had not developed her own independent judgment about how to treat people yet. She was still operating inside whatever framework the person she most respected in the workplace had established. The framework Sarah had established was clear. Julian watched it operate for one full day, and then he came back on the second day. The second day was when Mrs. Martha Asant arrived. He did not know it was Martha, not yet. He would not know it was Martha until much later, until the thing happened that revealed everything. What he saw on the second morning was an old woman. She was in her late 70s. She was dressed in clothes that were clean and carefully pressed but that were old, that had the specific quality of clothes that are given serious attention because there are not many others. She wore shoes that were sensible and worn. She carried a small handbag that had been repaired at the strap. She came through the main entrance of the hospital slowly, with the specific pace of someone who is managing pain and not advertising it. Julian was mopping the floor near the reception desk when she arrived. He saw her stop at the desk. He saw her wait. She was not served immediately even though Sarah was present and not engaged with another patient. This was the first thing. A woman who was visibly unwell, moving slowly, clearly in some distress, and the reception nurse was not immediately responsive. Martha waited. After approximately 90 seconds, Sarah looked up. Sarah's assessment of Martha took approximately 2 seconds. Julian watched it happen. He saw the specific calibration process, the quick read of the shoes, the dress, the handbag, the posture of someone who did not come from money, and the corresponding adjustment in Sarah's manner. Sarah said, "Yes." Not "good morning," not "how can I help you," just "yes." Martha said, and her voice was carefully controlled in the way of someone who is managing discomfort and presenting only what she needs to present. "I would like to see Dr. Julian Osai. I was told he sees patients here on Tuesdays and Fridays." Sarah said, "Dr. Osai is one of the most senior cardiac surgeons in the country. He does not see walk-in patients." Martha said, "I have a referral." She opened her handbag and removed a folded paper. Sarah looked at it. She did not take it. She looked at it from a distance. She said, "This is from a district clinic. Dr. Osai's referral requirements are for specialist-to-specialist referrals. This is a GP referral." Martha said, "The doctor at the clinic said it would be accepted here." Sarah said, "The doctor at the clinic was mistaken." Julian was 3 meters away. He could hear the conversation clearly. He moved his mop slowly, keeping his head down, maintaining the appearance of someone engaged in mopping. Martha said, "I am having chest pains. They have been worsening for 3 days. The clinic doctor said my heart." Sarah said, "If you are experiencing a cardiac emergency, you should go to the emergency department. But if you have been having this pain for 3 days, it is clearly not an emergency." This was medically incorrect. Julian noted it. Linda had appeared at the desk beside Sarah. She had heard the conversation. She said quietly to Sarah, and she was not quiet enough, "Look at her shoes." Sarah made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the vicinity. She said to Martha, "The Dr. Osai you're looking for doesn't see patients without a proper referral. You would need to go back to your clinic and ask them to submit a formal specialist referral, which can take 4 to 6 weeks. In the meantime, if you believe this is urgent, the public hospital has an outpatient cardiac clinic every Thursday." Martha said, "I was told Dr. Osai helps everyone, that he specifically." Sarah said, "Whoever told you that is not familiar with how this hospital actually works. Dr. Osai is an extremely busy and extremely senior physician. He does not see patients who arrive without proper arrangements." She turned away from the desk slightly, the specific body language signal of a conversation that has been ended. Martha stood at the desk. She did not leave. She was holding the edge of the desk with one hand, and Julian, watching her from 3 meters away with the detailed eye of someone who had spent 30 years reading physical symptoms, saw the way her other hand had moved to her chest. He saw the quality of her breathing. He saw the specific pallor that was beginning at the edges of her face. He moved toward the desk. He said, "Excuse me." Sarah turned to look at him with the expression she used for facilities staff, the expression that communicated the specific social distance between a nurse at the reception desk and the man mopping the floor. She said, "What?" He said, "This lady is not well. She needs to see someone." Linda made a sound. Sarah said, "Thank you for your medical opinion. Please go back to what you were doing." Julian said, "I am not giving a medical opinion. I am pointing out that a patient is showing signs of distress and is not being attended to. Sarah said, a patient requires proper documentation and proper referral. This woman has neither. Julian said, she is holding her chest with her left hand and her breathing is labored, and the color of her face has changed in the last 2 minutes. Sarah looked at him. She said, how would you know what her face looked like 2 minutes ago? And what exactly is your relevant expertise here? Linda said, not quietly, maybe the janitor wants to examine her himself. A beat. Sarah said, go back to your mop, this is not your area. Julian looked at her. He said, keeping his voice completely even, she needs to see a doctor. Sarah said, and I need you to go back to your assigned area, or I will report you to facilities management. Julian looked at Martha. Martha was looking at him. Her eyes were clear and focused despite the pain visible in her face. She looked at him with an expression that he would not be able to fully describe for years afterward, an expression that was looking at him from a distance and a depth that did not match the surface of the situation. She said to him quietly, I am all right. He said equally quietly, you are not. She said, I know. A pause. Sarah said, if you two are done, I need to ask you both to clear the reception area. Martha's hand tightened on the desk edge. And then she was not holding the desk edge. And then she was on the floor. She went down in the way that people go down when they have been fighting against gravity for longer than they had strength to fight. Not a collapse, a surrender. She had been holding herself upright for 3 days of worsening pain, and the holding had finally exceeded the capacity. Julian was beside her before anyone else moved. Not rushing, not panicking. Moving with the specific directed speed of someone who has done this thousands of times and knows exactly what they are doing and exactly what they need. He said, call a crash cart and get me an IV line and 5 mg of epinephrine. Now. His voice was different. The mopping voice was gone. The janitor's specific neutral tone was gone. What came out was the voice that 3,000 patients had heard in the moment before their surgery, the voice that his team recognized as the voice that meant we are in a serious situation and we are going to manage it perfectly. Sarah said, what? He said, crash cart, IV line, epinephrine, I will not say it a third time. Linda said, who do you think you are? You are a janitor. He said, I am a doctor, get me what I asked for. Sarah said, security. Julian ignored her. He was on the floor beside Martha, his fingers at her wrist reading the pulse, his eyes on her face reading the color, his mind running through the differential in the specific organized way he had been running differentials for 30 years. He said to Martha quietly and directly, Martha, can you hear me? Her eyes opened. She said, yes. He said, I need you to stay with me. I know where you are, I need you to stay there. She said, Julian. He said, yes. She said, I know it is you. He had no time to process this. Security arrived, 2 men. The senior one said, Sir, we need you to step back from the patient. Julian said, I am a physician. This patient is experiencing a cardiac event. If you remove me from this patient, she will die. Do you understand what I am telling you? The security guard said, we've been told. The other voice that came into the corridor at that moment was the voice that stopped everything. It was Mr. Darko, the hospital administrator, who had been called by Mrs. Adwoa because Mrs. Adwoa had been monitoring through the button camera that Julian was wearing and had seen what was happening and had made the specific call that needed to be made. Mr. Darko came around the corner and saw the scene. He saw the man on the floor in a grey janitor uniform with his fingers at an old woman's wrist, and the security guards and the nurses and every element of a situation that was going very wrong. Then he saw the man's face. Mr. Darko said, Dr. Osai. The corridor went completely quiet. Do not go anywhere, because what happens next is the part of the story that nobody was ready for. This is the moment to subscribe if you haven't. Hit that bell. The next section is the reveal and it is worth being there for. Mr. Benjamin Darko had worked as the hospital administrator of Osai Cardiac Institute for 9 years. He was 50 years old, a careful, organized man who was genuinely good at the operational management of a complex medical facility. He had never, in 9 years, walked into a situation like this one. He stood in the corridor and said, "Dr. Osai." The two words landed in the space with the specific weight of words that carry their full meaning. Nurse Sarah Mensah heard them. She turned toward Mr. Darko. She looked at the janitor on the floor beside the old woman. She looked at Mr. Darko. She looked at the janitor again. Her face did something that began as confusion and moved rapidly through recognition, and arrived at something that was not quite horror, but was in that vicinity. Nurse Linda Asante had not yet understood. She was still looking at the security guards. Then she looked at Mr. Darko's face, and then she looked at the janitor. Julian was not looking at either nurse. He was looking at Mr. Darko. He said, "I need a surgical team and or two. This patient is experiencing a myocardial infarction and she needs intervention within the next 30 minutes. Mr. Darko said, "Yes, doctor." He was on his radio before the sentence was finished. Julian said, "I also need someone to bring me a proper stethoscope and blood pressure equipment from the crash cart." Mr. Darko said, "On the way." The corridor was now full of people. Staff had arrived from adjacent departments, drawn by the radio calls and the specific quality of urgency that medical environments read very quickly. A cardiology registrar named Dr. Ama Boateng, who was 29 and had been in the hospital for her shift for 3 hours, came around the corner with a portable ECG machine and stopped when she saw who was on the floor. She said, "Dr. Osai." He said, "Ama, good, set up the ECG." She did, without further questions. This was one of the qualities Julian had looked for when he hired her, the ability to receive unexpected information and act on it without needing to first process it emotionally. The ECG confirmed what Julian had read from Martha's pulse and colour and breathing. A significant cardiac event in progress, the specific pattern that required surgical intervention rather than medication management alone. He said, "We are going to O2. Ama, you are with me. Call Kofi and tell him I need him scrubbing in 10 minutes. Dr. Kofi Mensah was his senior registrar, not related to Nurse Sarah despite the surname. A 35-year-old surgeon who was 3 years from being ready to lead a unit of his own, and who Julian had been mentoring with the specific patience of someone who had been mentored and understood what it required. The corridor organized itself around Julian's instructions with the efficiency of a team that knew how to move quickly when the signal was given. As they began to move Martha onto the gurney, Julian stood. He was still in the grey janitor uniform. He was still wearing the grey cap which he removed and held in his hand. The beard was his face. He turned to Sarah and Linda. He stood still for a moment. He did not make a speech. He did not raise his voice. He looked at both of them with the specific attention that he brought to everything. Then he said, "Mr. Darko will speak to you both today. Please be available." He turned and walked with the gurney. Behind him in the corridor, Nurse Linda put her hand over her mouth. Beside her, Nurse Sarah stood completely still with the specific stillness of someone who is going through a rapid inventory of everything they have said and done in the last 10 minutes. Mr. Darko watched them. He said, "My office at 4 o'clock, both of you." The surgical suite was where Julian was most completely himself. He had changed in the surgical prep room. One of the nurses had brought him a set of surgical scrubs without needing to be asked, understanding that whatever was happening with the janitor situation could be processed later, and the immediate requirement was that Dr. Osai be in appropriate clothing for surgery. He scrubbed in. The ritual of it, the specific sequence that he had performed thousands of times, settled him in the way that familiar precise processes settle people who rely on precision. The grey uniform was gone. The cap was gone. The beard was still there, which was slightly unusual but completely irrelevant in a surgical environment where everyone was masked and gowned. Dr. Ama Boateng was across the operating table from him. Dr. Kofi Mensah was to his right. The anesthesiologist, a woman named Dr. Priscilla Wusu who had worked with Julian for 6 years, had already brought Martha under anesthesia and was managing the airway with the focused calm that was her specific professional signature. The scrub nurse, a man named Emmanuel who had been in Julian's surgical team for 8 years, had the instruments arranged in the order Julian preferred. Emmanuel was one of the people who had worked with Julian long enough to know his preferences at a level of detail that made the surgery flow faster and more smoothly than it would with anyone less familiar. Julian looked at the monitors. He looked at Martha on the table. He thought, I do not know if this is the Martha I am thinking of. The corridor had been fast, and the focus had been clinical, and he had not had the time or the space to process what she had said before everything moved to the surgical emergency. She had said, I know it is you. He had said, yes, sir. She had said, Julian. He had said, yes, sir. He had heard it, but he had filed it under things to think about after, because the priority was keeping her alive, and the surgery required his entire mind. Now she was on the table, and the surgery was beginning, and his entire mind was on the surgery. He operated for 2 hours and 17 minutes. The blockage was significant, the kind that had been building for longer than 3 days. The 3 days of chest pain that Martha had described were the acute phase of something that had been developing for longer. The surgery required a bypass graft, which was within Julian's specific expertise as a cardiac surgeon, and he performed it with the precision that had produced those outcomes that medical journals published. There were 2 moments in the surgery where the situation became more difficult. The first was at 43 minutes when a secondary vessel showed a complication that required a rapid decision. Julian made the decision in approximately 4 seconds, communicated it to Kofi and Armour in 2 sentences, and they responded without hesitation. The vessel was managed. The surgery continued. The second was at 1 hour and 50 minutes, when Martha's blood pressure dropped in a way that required the anesthesiologist to intervene and required Julian to pause and assess before continuing. He paused. He assessed. He continued. At 2 hours and 17 minutes, he stepped back. He looked at the monitors. He looked at Armour and Kofi and Priscilla and Emmanuel. He said, good work. He looked at Martha one more time. He said to Armour, stay with her through recovery. Call me immediately when she is conscious. Then he went to change. The call came 2 hours and 40 minutes later. Julian was in his office, which was the first time he had been in his office in 3 days, and which felt slightly strange after 3 days of corridors and a mop. He was wearing his own clothes, a suit he had kept in his office for the first time he needed to be himself again quickly, and he was looking at the statement that Mr. Darko had prepared about the morning's events. Mrs. Adwoa had downloaded the footage from the button camera. It was clear. Every word, every expression, every moment of the interaction between Sarah, Linda, and Martha was documented. His phone rang. He picked it up. Armour said, she is conscious, she is asking for you. He said, I am coming. Martha was in the private recovery room. She was pale and attached to monitoring equipment, and she looked smaller than she had looked on the corridor floor, which was not physically possible, but was the impression that people in hospital beds sometimes gave. She looked smaller because the specific quality of self-containment that she had been maintaining in the corridor, the holding herself together, was no longer necessary, and without it she was simply herself, which was an old woman who had had major heart surgery that morning. Julian came through the door. She looked at him. He had the beard, he was in his suit now. He was recognizably Dr. Julian Osa again rather than the man with the mop. But he was also the person who had been on the floor beside her in the corridor, and she was looking at him with the full knowledge of both. He sat in the chair beside her bed. He said, how do you feel? She said, I have had better mornings. He almost smiled. He said, the surgery went well, you are going to be all right. She said, I know, you did the surgery. He said, yes. She said, I told you I would be all right as soon as I saw you. He looked at her. He said, Martha. She said, yes. He said, I need to ask you something. She said, ask. He said, how did you know it was me? In the corridor, you said you knew it was me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have been looking at that face since you were 6 years old, Julian. You can grow a beard. You can put on different clothes. But you cannot change the way you look at a patient. He said, what do you mean? She said, the way you looked at me when you walked over, the way you read the situation. I have seen that look on doctors, and on people who will become doctors, and on people who will not. You have that look, and you have had it since you were 12 years old watching the doctor with your sister. He looked at her. He said, you knew before I came over. She said, I knew when I walked in. He said, what? She said, Julian, I did not come here because I was having a heart attack. A pause. He said, you were having a heart attack. She said, "Yes, I know, that part was genuinely inconvenient, but I did not come here for the surgery." He said, "Then why did you come?" She was quiet again. The monitor beside her made its steady sounds. The afternoon light came through the window of the private room. She looked at him with the specific expression he had not been able to describe since the corridor, the expression that was looking at him from a distance and a depth. She said, "I heard things about the hospital, about how poor patients were being treated." He said, "How did you hear?" She said, "I know people. I have been a teacher in this city for 40 years. My students are everywhere. One of them brought her mother here last month and told me what happened at the reception desk." He said, "So you came to see for yourself?" She said, "I came to see if you knew." He looked at her. She said, "I came to see whether the boy I taught, the boy I bought books for and wrote letters for and gave my savings for, had become a man who knew what was happening in his own hospital and allowed it, or whether he had simply not looked." A long silence. He said, "Which was it?" She said, "You were mopping floors in a janitor uniform." He said, "Yes." She said, "So you were already looking?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Good, then I can relax." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You could have simply called me." She said, "I know." He said, "Or come through the proper channels." She said, "I know." He said, "You came as a patient without proper referral documentation, because you needed to see what happened to patients without proper referral documentation." She said, "Yes." He said, "You knew you had a heart condition." She said, "Yes, my doctor told me 3 months ago. Manageable," he said, "with the right care." He said, "And you decided to use it to test my hospital." She was quiet. Then she said, "I decided to come and see the boy I raised." He looked at her. She said, "Not the famous surgeon, not the hospital director. The boy, the one who cleaned the board when nobody asked him to and who brought back every book in better condition than he found it. I wanted to know if he was still there." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Was he?" She said, "The man I saw on that floor this morning, kneeling in a dirty uniform telling a nurse to get an IV line, saying I will not say it a third time in a voice that could have stopped traffic, yes. He was there." Julian looked at his hands, the hands that had spent 30 years operating on hearts, the hands that had just operated on hers. He said, "I owe you everything." She said, "No." He said, "I do, you know I do." She said, "You owe the next Julian, the next child who is sitting in a primary school somewhere right now who has what you had and needs someone to see it. You owe them what I gave you. That is what you owe me." He looked at her. He said, "I am already doing that." She said, "I know, but you could do more." He said, "I will do more." She looked at him. She said, "Now go and deal with those nurses, and then come back and tell me what you decided. I want to know what kind of man you are when you are angry at someone who deserves it." He almost smiled again. He said, "Rest." She said, "I will rest when you come back." He stood. He walked to the door. He stopped, he turned around. He said, "Mrs. Asante." She looked at him. He said, "I knew it was you too, in the corridor, when you said my name." She looked at him. He said, "I was not going to let anything happen to you." She said, "I know you weren't." He went to deal with the nurses. "Stay right here, because what happens next is the justice this story has been building toward, and it is worth every second." Mr. Darko's office was on the 2nd floor. It was a practical office, the office of a man who used it rather than displayed it. A large desk with organized files, 2 chairs across from the desk for visitors, a window overlooking the hospital's courtyard, garden that Julian had commissioned when the building was built, because he believed that patients and staff needed access to something growing. The garden had a jacaranda tree in the center that was 15 years old now, and that bloomed purple every spring. It was 4:15 in the afternoon when the meeting happened. Mr. Darko sat behind his desk. Julian sat in one of the visitor chairs, which was slightly unusual since in most meetings of this nature, Julian would have been at his own desk. He had chosen Mr. Darko's office because this was primarily an administrative matter, and he wanted Mr. Darko to manage the administrative dimensions of it, which required that Mr. Darko be in his own chair. Nurse Sarah Menser and Nurse Linda Asant sat in chairs that had been brought in for the meeting, side by side, but with a distance between them that had not been present that morning. The morning had produced a recalibration of their alignment. They were no longer operating as a unit. Julian's personal assistant, Mrs. Adwoa, was present. She had a laptop. There was also a fourth person in the room, the hospital's head of nursing, a woman named Mrs. Grace Ampong, who was 55 years old, who had been Julian's head of nursing since the hospital opened, and who had received the news of the morning's events from Mr. Darko at lunchtime, with an expression that moved through several stages before arriving at the specific focused attention of someone who intended to fix something that needed fixing. Julian began. He said, "Before I say anything about this morning, I want to say something about why I was in this hospital, wearing a uniform that was not mine." He looked at both nurses. He said, "I heard things, not formal complaints, not reports, informal things, the kind of things that come to you indirectly when something is wrong in the way that only people who are experiencing it directly can describe. I heard that patients who came here without money, without proper clothes, without the specific language and bearing of people who are used to being taken seriously, were not being treated the same as patients who came here with all of those things." He paused. He said, "This hospital has one policy about that. One, it does not matter who you are or where you come from or how much you have. You are treated with the same attention, the same respect, and the same quality of care as every other patient in this building. That is the policy. It has been the policy since the first day we opened. It is not a suggestion and it is not an aspiration. It is the standard of this hospital and it is non-negotiable." He said, "I went undercover because I needed to see whether the standard was being met." He said it was not being met. He looked at Sarah first. He said, "You were on duty this morning when an elderly woman arrived with a referral from her clinic and a complaint of chest pain that had been worsening for 3 days. You assessed her by looking at her shoes and her dress. You provided her with incorrect medical information. You told her that 3 days of worsening chest pain was not an emergency, which is not correct, and you know it is not correct. You dismissed her from the desk without completing an intake assessment. When she expressed that she was in pain and mentioned my name as someone who helped all patients, you told her I do not see patients like her." The room was quiet. Julian said, "Those are your words. They were recorded. I will not be asking whether you said them." He said, "I would like to ask you one question and I would like a genuine answer. Not a defensive one, not a managed one, a genuine one." Sarah was looking at the desk. Julian said, "Why did you treat her that way?" A long silence. Sarah said, "I don't know." Julian said, "I am going to accept that as a genuine answer." She looked up. He said, "I think you do not know. I think you have been operating inside a way of doing things that developed gradually, that nobody formally challenged, that felt normal because it had become normal, and that you have not sat down and examined from the outside. I think if I asked you at the start of your career whether you would tell an old woman in chest pain that she did not qualify for care, you would have said no, absolutely not. That is why I became a nurse." He looked at her steadily. He said, "Something happened between then and now. I do not know exactly what, but something in the environment of this hospital allowed a pattern to develop that should have been caught and corrected much earlier. The responsibility for that is not only yours, some of it is mine." The room was very still. He said, "That said, what happened this morning was not a small thing. The woman you dismissed from this desk had a myocardial infarction on the floor of this corridor 20 minutes after you turned her away. She survived because I happened to be in the corridor. If I had not been there, if she had taken the advice you gave her and gone to the public clinic, she would have died on the way there." He let that sit. He said, "I need you to understand the full weight of what that means." Sarah said nothing. Linda said, "Dr. Osai, I know this doesn't." He said, "I will come to you, Linda." She stopped. He said to Sarah, "I have spoken with Mrs. Ampong and Mr. Darko. You are suspended from clinical duties effective today. During that suspension, you will complete a mandatory professional development program that addresses patient dignity, equity in healthcare delivery, and the specific obligations of nursing staff in a facility like this one. That program will take 6 weeks. At the end of it, Mrs. Ampong will assess whether you return to clinical duties and in what capacity. If you return, you will be on a monitored performance review for 12 months. He said, if at any point during that period there is another instance of the behavior I observed this morning, your employment here ends. Sarah said, yes, Dr. Osai. He turned to Linda. He said, Linda, you are younger. You have been qualified for 4 years. The pattern you exhibited this morning was one you followed rather than initiated. I watched it. You calibrated yourself to Sarah's lead and you said things and made sounds that you would not have made if you had been acting on your own judgment. He said, that is a different problem from Sarah's. It is not a better problem. It is a different one. He said, you are also suspended from clinical duties. Your program is the same as Sarah's. But what I want you to think about during that suspension, and I mean genuinely think about, is this. You will spend your career in rooms where things happen that you will have to decide whether to follow or whether to correct. The ability to be the person who corrects is the thing that will determine what kind of nurse you become. He said, you have not fully become who you are going to be yet. That is still open. The decision is still yours. Linda was crying, quietly without making it a performance. She was crying in the way of someone who has genuinely understood something and is in the specific pain of that understanding. She said, I am so sorry. He said, I know. He stood. He said, this is not the end of the conversation. It is the beginning of a process. But the process has to begin clearly, and this is where it begins. He turned to Mrs. Ampong. He said, Grace, I need you to do a comprehensive review of how patients are received in this hospital. Not just the desk. The intake process, the waiting areas, the communication between reception and clinical staff, everything that touches the patient before they reach a doctor. I want a report in 3 weeks. Mrs. Ampong said, you will have it. He said, and I want to hear from you what you think went wrong here, not what you can identify in retrospect, what you think the structural problem is. She said, I think the problem is that we set standards, and then we trusted that the standards were being lived without checking whether they were being lived. The standards were right. The monitoring was insufficient. He said, yes, that is what I think too, and that is partly my failure. She looked at him. He said, the policy is not the problem. The implementation is the problem, and the implementation is my responsibility because this is my hospital. He said, we are going to fix this, properly, not with a memo and not with one meeting, with a systematic change in how this hospital monitors its own behavior. He said to Mr. Darko, I want a patient advocate position created. Someone whose specific job is to receive and investigate patient experience complaints, including informal ones. Someone who reports directly to me, not through management layers. Mr. Darko said, I will draw up the structure. He said, I also want a monthly patient experience review at the board level. Not operational numbers, patient experience, direct testimony from patients where possible. He said, and I want a fund established specifically for the kind of patient who came in this morning. The kind who has a referral from a district clinic and chest pain, and the specific situation that means they do not have the documentation or the connections to navigate the formal intake process. A fast-track pathway, staffed by someone who understands that navigating a complex healthcare system is harder when you have nothing backing you up. He said, these are not suggestions, these are decisions I am making today. Mr. Darko said, yes, Dr. Osai. Julian looked around the room. He said, this hospital was built for every patient equally. It was built that way because I believe that the quality of care a person receives should not depend on what they wear or what they carry in their handbag or whether they know the specific language of medical administration. I believed that when we opened, and I believe it now. He said, I was mopping your floors for 3 days to find out whether that belief was being lived in this building. It was not being lived well enough. He said, that changes today. He went back to the recovery room. Stay right here, because the final part of this story is the part that will stay with you longest. Martha spent 4 days in the hospital. Julian visited every morning, not as the hospital director on a formal round. He came in the morning before his surgical schedule began, when the ward was quieter, and the light was at the quality that early light has in hospital rooms when the day has not yet become what it is going to be. He brought tea the second morning, which Martha accepted with the expression of someone who had been making Julian tea for 40 years and found it satisfying to receive it in return. They talked, not always about serious things, sometimes about the hospital about what Julian had seen in the 3 days of mopping, about the review Mrs. Ampong was conducting, and the structural changes he had initiated. Martha listened to these conversations with the specific analytical attention of someone who had spent 40 years watching institutions and understanding how they worked and how they failed. But sometimes they talked about other things. She told him about her students. She had retired from formal teaching 8 years ago, but she had not stopped teaching, which is the thing about people for whom teaching is identity rather than occupation. She was involved in 2 community programs, a Saturday literacy group for children in her neighborhood whose parents worked on Saturdays and who were left without academic support for the weekend, and a mentoring program for secondary school students who had been identified as capable, but who did not have the family resources to fully realize that capability. She talked about these programs the way Julian talked about his surgeries, with the specific, precise enthusiasm of someone who is describing the work they were put on earth to do. He said, "How many students are in the Saturday program?" She said, 23. Some of them come every week. Some of them come when they can, which depends on whether they are needed at home. He said, "Who funds it?" She said, "I fund it mostly." He said, "With your pension?" She said, "With what I have." He was quiet. She said, "Do not look at me like that." He said, "Like what?" She said, "Like you are about to make it into a large gesture. It does not need to be a large gesture." He said, "It needs to be funded properly." She said, "It needs to be what it is, which is a room on Saturdays, some books, and someone who shows up." He said, "The showing up would be easier with proper funding." She looked at him. She said, "Julian." He said, "Yes." She said, "I did not come here to get funding for my programs." He said, "I know." She said, "I came here to see you, as I said." He said, "I know that too, can I not do both?" A pause. She said, "You are going to fund it whether I say yes or not." He said, "Probably." She said, "That is very presumptuous." He said, "You taught me that the most useful thing you can do with resources is put them in the right hands. Your hands are the right hands." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "There is a 3rd program I have been trying to start and cannot afford to." He said, "Tell me." She told him. The 3rd program was more ambitious than the Saturday literacy group or the mentoring scheme. It was a scholarship fund for children whose circumstances matched what Julian's had been 40 years ago. Identifiable capability, genuine work ethic, and a set of family circumstances that made the path from capability to career genuinely difficult without external support. Not just money, though money was part of it. Also mentorship, practical guidance, the specific navigation support that made the difference between a capable child finding the path and losing it. She had been trying to start this program for 3 years. The money she needed to establish it properly, to give it a structure that would survive longer than her own involvement, was beyond what she could assemble from her pension and the small donations she had been collecting. Julian listened to everything she described. Then he said, "What would you need to run it properly for 5 years?" She told him. He said, "And for 10. She told him. He said, "And who would run it, after you? Who is the person who knows how to do what you do?" She said, "I have someone in mind, a former student. She is 28, she is a primary school teacher, and she has that thing, the specific thing. She sees children the way I saw you." He said, "Her name." She told him. He said, "I will speak to her." Martha looked at him. She said, "Julian, this is more than." He said, "It is not more than anything. It is exactly proportional. You put money into me at a moment when the money was the difference between one path and another. That is what this fund is going to do for children who are currently in the position I was in. It is a direct transaction. Money in, future out." She said, "You cannot calculate it like that." He said, "I can try." She looked at him. She said, "Do you know what I want?" He said, "Tell me." She said, "I want the fund to be called the Emmanuel Johnson Scholarship." He looked at her. She said, "That was your janitor name, the name on the facility's paperwork." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want it named Emmanuel Johnson because Emmanuel Johnson was the man mopping the floor who stepped forward when an old woman was being dismissed. The famous doctor did not step forward. The janitor did. and that matters." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The Emmanuel Johnson Scholarship." She said, "Yes, so that whoever receives it understands that who you are when you have nothing is who you actually are." He looked at her. He said, "You planned this." She said, "I planned none of this. I came to see you and my heart had other ideas. But when you sat down beside me on the floor of that corridor in your dirty uniform and told the nurse you would not say it a third time, I understood what I wanted the fund to be named." He said, "How could you have understood that before we had this conversation?" She said, "Because I have known you for 50 years, Julian. I understand how you think. And I knew that whatever came out of this situation, you would want to build something from it. You always build something." He said, "You have not known me for 50 years. I am 54. She said, "I have known you since you were 4 years old. Your mother brought you to the school when she came to register you, and you sat in the chair outside my classroom with your feet not quite reaching the floor, and you looked at the classroom through the open door. For the entire 20 minutes, she was speaking to the administrator." He said, "I did not know you saw me then." She said, "I was watching through the window. You looked at my classroom the way people look at something they want very badly but have not yet been given permission to want." He was quiet. She said, "I decided then that you were going to be in my class." He said, "I was in the other teacher's class the following year." She said, "I requested you." He stared at her. She said, "I had seen enough children to know which ones needed specific attention. You needed mine." He said, "You requested me when I was 4 years old." She said, "Yes, before you had done anything, before you had shown anyone anything, just from watching you look at my classroom for 20 minutes. He looked at her. He said, "Why?" She said, "Because of the way you looked at it. Not with excitement. Not with the way children look at things that are bright and attractive. You looked at it like you were calculating. Like you were working out what it was and what it meant and what it would take to be inside it." She said, "I have been watching children all my life. That look, the calculating look, is very rare in a 4-year-old. It means something specific. I don't know exactly what, but it means something." He said, "You built everything on a 4-year-old looking at your classroom door." She said, "I built nothing. You built everything. I provided some materials." He said, "You provided the materials, and then you came to a hospital 50 years later to check whether the building was still standing." She looked at him. She said, "Yes, that is exactly right." He said, "And is it?" She said, "It was touch and go this morning." He almost laughed. Genuinely almost laughed, which was not something he did often in hospital rooms. She said, "But yes, it is standing, a little cracked in some places. You are fixing the cracks. That is enough." He said, "It is not enough. It is the beginning of enough." She said, "Then the beginning of enough is enough to be getting on with." He looked at her. He said, "I am going to spend the rest of my career getting on with it." She said, "I know." He said, "Will you help me?" She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The fund, the Saturday program, all of it. I want your input, not your involvement in the operational sense. You have done enough operational work for several lifetimes. But your thinking, your judgment, the kind of thinking that decided a 4-year-old was worth watching." She looked at him. She said, "You want to consult me?" He said, "I want the benefit of 50 years of you knowing exactly what matters and what does not." She was quiet. Then she said, "I will need proper tea, not the hospital tea, proper tea." He said, "I will arrange it." She said, "And you will actually come and talk to me, not send someone?" He said, "I will come myself." She said, "Then yes, I will help you." The practical things happened quickly, because Julian was a person for whom the gap between a decision and its execution was as small as he could make it. The Emmanuel Johnson Scholarship Fund was established within 3 months of Martha's discharge. It was funded with a contribution from Julian's personal resources that would run the program for 15 years, and a structure that he asked Mrs. Adwoa to set up to ensure that the fund was self-sustaining beyond the initial contribution through a matched giving arrangement with several of his grateful patients who had been looking for a worthy recipient. The young woman Martha had mentioned, whose name was Abba and who was 28 and a primary school teacher with, as Martha had described it, the specific thing, came to the hospital for a meeting with Julian. He had expected someone who was impressive in the way of people who have been told they are impressive, and have adjusted to being treated that way. What arrived was someone who had never been told she was impressive and who was therefore entirely herself, which was considerably more interesting than someone who had been told. She was late to the meeting, not very late, 8 minutes. She apologized directly without over-explaining, which Julian noted because over-explaining was what people did when they were trying to manage his impression of them, and she was not doing that. She asked him what the fund was for before she asked what her role in it would be, which told him that her first instinct was toward the purpose rather than toward herself. He offered her the position of program director. She said, "I would need to think about this properly. Can I ask you questions?" He said, "Yes." She asked 12 questions. They were the right 12 questions, the questions that showed she was thinking about whether the program was built in a way that would actually work, rather than whether accepting the position would be good for her. He answered all 12. She said, "I would like a week to think about it." He said, "You have a week." She came back in 6 days and accepted. The Saturday program in Martha's neighborhood was funded within a month of the scholarship fund's establishment. Julian visited it once, on a Saturday morning, without announcement. He arrived at the community hall that Martha used for the sessions and sat at the back while Martha ran her group of 23 children, and he watched. He watched Martha in her specific professional environment for the first time since he had been one of the children in her classroom 50 years ago. She was exactly the same. The children were different ages, different situations, different starting points. She held all of them simultaneously with the specific organizational quality of a very experienced teacher and the specific personal attention of someone for whom each child was genuinely individual. She corrected and encouraged and challenged and supported, and sometimes said nothing at all, and just sat beside a child who was struggling, and let the sitting beside be the whole of the intervention. He sat at the back for 2 hours. When the session ended and the children were packing up, Martha saw him. She said, "How long have you been there?" He said, 2 hours. She said, "You could have told me you were coming." He said, "I could have." She looked at him. She said, "Well." He said, "You are exactly the same." She said, "I know." He said, "I mean that as the highest possible compliment." She said, "I know that too." He said, "Come on, I am taking you for proper tea." She said, "Where?" He said, "I found a place. A woman runs it on the next street. Apparently she has been running it for 20 years and her tea is better than anything in the city." Martha said, "I know her." He said, "Of course you do." They walked to the tea shop. 3 months after the events at the hospital, Julian made a decision about his own practice that surprised people who did not know him well and surprised nobody who did. He reduced his surgical schedule. Not stopped operating, he would operate for as long as his hands allowed, but he reduced the number of procedures he took on per month and redirected the time to 2 things. The first was the establishment of a training program for young cardiac surgeons from districts where specialist training was not available locally. He brought 12 residents per year to the hospital for a 6-month intensive program. He taught them himself, in the surgical suite and in the classroom, with the specific attention of someone who understood what having a teacher who paid proper attention could produce. The second was time. He spent time in his hospital in a way he had not spent it before, not in administrative meetings or at his desk, moving through the building, being visible in corridors and waiting areas, and the cafeteria where patients and family members sat with the specific weight of people who were waiting for something to go one way or another. He learned the names of people who worked in every department. He learned the name of Emmanuel, the scrub nurse's daughter, who was 7 and wanted to be a marine biologist. He learned that the woman who managed the cafeteria had a son who was applying to medical school and who needed guidance on the personal statement. He learned that one of his senior registrars was considering leaving the hospital for a higher-paying position in London, and arranged a conversation with him that had nothing to do with salary and everything to do with what he was trying to build and what role in it was available. He was not a different person. He was a more present version of the person he had always been. Martha said, when he described this to her on a Thursday afternoon over tea in the shop on the next street from the Saturday program, "You are doing what I did." He said, "What?" She said, "You are walking the floor and learning who is there." He said, yes. She said, I did that for 40 years. He said, I know. She said, it is the only thing that works. Everything else is policy, that is actual. He said, yes. She said, and how does it feel? He thought about it. He said, it feels like what I should have been doing for 15 years. She said, yes, but you are doing it now, and that is what matters. He said, is it enough? She looked at him. She said, Julian, stop asking if things are enough. You will never feel like it is enough. That is not a problem. That is the engine, use it. He looked at her. He said, you have been telling me what to do with my own psychology since I was 6 years old. She said, yes, and you have been resisting and then doing it anyway since you were 6 years old. I expect this to continue. He almost laughed again. She said, drink your tea, you have a surgery at 3. He drank his tea. Nurse Sarah Munzer completed the 6-week professional development program. She came back to clinical duties with a quality in her Bahavark that the head of nursing, Mrs. Umpung, described in her review as genuinely changed rather than performed. The specific calibration by which she had been adjusting her manner based on patients' apparent wealth or status was gone. In its place was something that the other nurses who worked with her noticed without knowing what they were noticing: a more uniform quality of attention. She was not perfect. She had days that were difficult. She had days where the habits of years tried to reassert themselves and she caught herself and redirected. But she was doing the catching and the redirecting, which was the thing that mattered. She came to Julian's office 3 months after she returned to clinical duties and asked to speak with him. He said, yes. She sat across from him. She said, I wanted to tell you something. He said, tell me. She said, the patient from that morning, the old woman. He said, Mrs. Usunter. She said, yes, is she all right? He said, she is recovering well. She said, I wanted to know if I could apologize to her, properly, in person. He was quiet. He said, that is her decision, I can ask her. She said, I know you don't owe me that. He said, I will ask her. He asked Martha. Martha said, what does she want to say? He relayed the question. Sarah said she wants to apologize. Martha thought about it. She said, yes, tell her yes, but tell her to come on a Saturday morning. He said, why Saturday? She said, because I will be at the program. And if she is serious about understanding what she got wrong, she can sit at the back and watch what it looks like when poor children are given the full attention they are owed. He relayed this. Sarah came on a Saturday. She sat at the back of the community hall, and she watched Martha run the program for 2 hours. Afterward, she sat with Martha and they talked for 40 minutes. Julian was not present for this conversation. He did not know exactly what was said. What Martha told him afterward was, she is going to be all right. She just needed someone to show her what it looked like from the other side. Lunda Usuntar stayed in nursing. She was a different kind of challenge from Sarah. Where Sarah had developed a bad pattern that needed to be replaced, Lunda had not yet developed a pattern. She was still in the process of becoming, which meant she could still become things. She came back to clinical duties after the program with something that Mrs. Umpung described as a spine. Not an arrogant spine. A grounded one. She had developed, during the 6 weeks, the beginning of her own judgment. The ability to look at a situation and decide what she thought about it independent of what the person she most respected in the room thought about it. Julian spoke to her once briefly in the corridor, 3 months after she returned. He said, how is it going? She said, better, I think. He said, I think so too. She said, can I ask you something? He said, yes. She said, when you were on the floor beside her, did you know she was someone you knew? He said, not until she said my name. She said, and before that, when you went over, when you didn't know who she was? He said, yes. She said, why did you go over? You were supposed to be just the janitor. Nobody would have known you were there. He was quiet for a moment. He said, because she was a person in pain being dismissed. That is why. She said, that is it. He said, that is it. She thought about this. He said, that is the whole job, Lunda. That is the whole job. A person in pain is in front of you, you go over, everything else is administrative. She said, "That sounds too simple." He said, "The simple version is always true. The complicated version is what we invent when we want to justify not doing the simple thing." She looked at him. She said, "Mrs. Assunta told Sarah something at the community hall. Sarah told me." He said, "What did she say?" Lunda said, "She said that the way you treat people who can do nothing for you is the truest thing about you." He said, "Yes." She said it is also the thing that is most changeable, if you decide to change it. He said, "She has been saying that for 50 years. Lunda said, "She seems like someone worth listening to." He said, "She is the most worth listening to person I have ever met." Lunda said, "I am going to try." He said, "I know." He walked down the corridor. She went back to work. That is the story. A famous surgeon who put on a dirty uniform to find out whether his hospital was treating poor patients properly. An old woman who walked into that hospital because she needed to see whether the boy she raised had stayed the man she believed he was. A locket's worth of trust that went back 50 years. And 2 nurses who needed to be shown something they had stopped seeing. But before we end, I want to say one thing that I think this story is actually about. It is not about the disguise was the method. It is not even about the nurses, though what they did mattered and needed to be addressed. This story is about what Martha did. Martha Asant spent 40 years teaching primary school children. She was paid a primary school teacher's salary. She gave money from that salary to a student who would not have known where to find it otherwise. She sat with him in her kitchen and lent him books and wrote letters for him and followed up phone calls until doors opened. She did all of this and she asked for nothing. And then, 30 years later, when she wanted to check whether it had worked, she walked into his hospital. Not to claim anything, not to announce herself. She walked in as a patient without proper documentation, and she sat at the reception desk and she found out what happened to patients without proper documentation. She did this because she understood that the real test of what she had invested in was not how famous he had become. It was not what the medical journals said, or what the outcomes data showed, or what his name meant when you said it in a hospital corridor. The real test was what happened when a poor old woman walked through his door. The answer to that test was mixed on the morning she arrived. But the answer that mattered was the man in the grey uniform on the floor of the corridor saying, "She needs to see a doctor. I will not say it a third time." The answer that mattered was someone who had everything going to see for himself whether the people who had nothing were being treated right. Because he had been the person who had nothing, and he had not forgotten what it felt like. The janitor was the real doctor. The doctor's coat was what came after. Never forget the janitor. This has been Folktale Peak. If this story hit something real in you, hit that like button right now. 1 second, that is how you tell us this matters. Subscribe to Folktale Peak, turn on the notification bell. We are here every week with a story that stays with you. The kind of story about people who do the right thing when nobody is watching, and what happens when someone finally is. Share this video with one person who needs it. The person in your life who is working hard in a way that nobody sees yet. The person who is still carrying the mop. Tell them the janitor story is worth knowing. And drop a comment below. Tell us, who is your Mrs. Martha Asant? Who is the person who saw something in you and invested in it before you had proven anything? Tell us their name. Put it in the comments. Let it exist somewhere people can see it. This is Folktale Peak. The person who helps you when you are a janitor in life is the person who deserves everything when you become the doctor. We will see you in the next story.